American cowboy was a common laborer. He had a very special set of skills, but so does a cobbler, so does a butcher, so does an accountant. What allowed the American cowboy to rise up to this level of becoming an American icon, one that almost everyone can relate to? And I think we have to give credit to someone who's standing in this picture right here. I think most people's eyes go toward these humans here. There are 8 of them. There are 8 cowboys here, but there are also 8 horses. And the horse literally elevated the cowboy several feet, but it was enough. You know, and it's said, I don't know how many times I've run across this in my research, that a cowboy would rather mount his horse and cross the street on his horse and then retie to go into a store rather than walk it. So let's pay tribute here to these 8 horses. The few feet that takes him above the other occupations of the world seem to be enough. You can think of the prairie like an ocean, and with the cowboy on his horse, he was the captain of his own ship, even though he worked for perhaps a trail boss or back at the ranch to a foreman, or he was responsible to meeting the needs of the owner of the cattle. He still was the captain of his own ship, because of the relationship between the human and the horse that's just simply special. And probably no other culture exemplifies that better than the Native Americans. But I would say that coming up to a second place in that would be be a close tie between the American cowboy and the cowboy whom they emulated, whom they learned the trades from and the skills and the appurtenances that go along with being a cowboy. And that would be the vaqueros, the Spanish herdsmen. Many times I think of when a horse was stolen by a native. And you know, that was sport in those days. That was a big part of becoming a man in native cultures. But when you got on a horse and you traveled the prairie that way, that was a sense of freedom. And the closest thing I can compare that to these days might be a 16-year-old getting a driver's license. You know, there's an element of freedom in all that. And look at how it's really blossomed throughout all of our lives. Think what the car means to us now, a way to get around the way we do. I was talking to someone right before this program about the great difference in how we think of distance now versus how people in the 1800s did. I was mentioning to someone that one of my main research focus most of my life was on Wyatt Earp and his brothers. And when Wyatt was a deputy sheriff in Tombstone, Arizona, you know, he was simply a deputy there serving as sheriff for Tombstone, because the true sheriff, the high sheriff, was in Tucson. What is that, 70, 90 miles away? And every time Wyatt took a prisoner to jail, he rode on horseback with that prisoner from Tombstone to Tucson and back. And they thought nothing of that. And what if I told you right now that you had to travel from Tombstone to Tucson next week on a horse? Well, that open sea of the prairie that sense was also captured by the American cowboy. Working from a horse is a lot of work. There's a lot of demands with that. At the end of this program, I'm going to read you a couple of excerpts from diaries of cowboys who were on trail drives and what that was like. I'll bet everyone in this room has seen Lonesome Dove, right? That's kind of the ultimate movie trail drive right there. Isn't it interesting that it's most people's favorite Western, and it was a TV series for a short time, TV miniseries. This is where it all began. The cowboy began here with the Spanish conquistadors. That's a word that means conqueror. The Spanish came here in order to find wealth. They wanted to find riches and resources, and they gained slaves by taking Native Americans as slaves. They traveled throughout the Southwest, and they brought with them this magnificent animal, the horse. And this was about to change everything for the Plains Indians, and eventually for the American cowboy as well. So with all these things that the conquistadors were hoping to get back from the New World, what did they give back? This is probably the best answer to that question. In the century and a half after 1492, 80% of Native Americans were gone from disease. They had no resistance to the diseases that came from Europe. But the Spanish brought this animal and one other that we'll talk about. Let's talk horse first. In North America, we had 2 native horses that went extinct. Eohippus, right there, and stilt-legged horse. They went extinct, so there were no horses here at the time of humans. But the horses that were brought over by the conquistadors sometimes got lost, got stolen, ran off. This is the way that our country was literally fed this species of animal to live here. The wild mustangs. By the 1800s, guess how many wild mustangs there were in the prairie, in the Great Plains of America? Over 2 million. From 1492 until the 1800s, that's how much it increased. Now let's look at the other animal that was brought. And this one can't be underestimated in our story. You know, to the Spanish conquistadors, this was traveling food supply. That's why they brought them. And think, you know, when you look at this here in America, you think, okay, it was, you know, it's part of the Spanish culture here at that time, but think about getting here. They came over on the ships just like the human beings did. Can you imagine that voyage to a steer? So the Longhorns became part of the landscape here because they too would sometimes run off. They too would be stolen. That was a great sport again. And boy, what a find this was for a Native American to steal this and take it home. Can you just imagine the value that it provided just in meat alone? During the Civil War, the menfolk of the South, including the Southwest, went east to fight in the war. And during those 4 years, the Longhorns, who were feral at that time, reproduced at a rate that will just stun you when I'll tell you that in Texas alone, in the 1850 or so, in Texas alone, there were 3 million wandering steers, longhorns. So somebody came back from the war and had a terrific idea. This was a very enterprising man who thought, if we can get these animals and we can drive them to the east where the population is just hungry for meat, we could make a fortune. But to think about driving cattle all the way from Texas to the eastern seaboard was a bit too much. So they had to take those steers to one of the railheads. So every place that the Transcontinental Railroad, which went through Nebraska, to give us some perspective in the West, every spur that came down and terminated was guaranteed to be a boom town because it was a little closer to Texas. So your first ones went down into Missouri and down into Kansas, and those became the famous towns that you've heard about all your life as being the cattle towns, the boom towns. Caldwell, Wichita, Dodge City, Ellsworth, Caldwell. Those all became famous simply because they got closer to Texas, and now they became a focal point where herds would be driven to. So there would be huge herds all around these towns waiting for their turn to be shipped to the hub of the meat slaughter in America was in Chicago. And so that's where all the cattle went. They boarded these trains, and what a life for the steers. Crossing the Atlantic and now taking a train ride from Kansas all the way to Illinois. Those boom towns became very famous because of basically the clashes that came about between the cowboys who had driven the cattle north, working for $1 a day and traveling for 3 months, and during that time having to go through any number of hardships, like river crossings were dreaded, lightning storms were dreaded. The clash between those cowboys who felt like, all right, we've been on the trail for 3 months, by God, we have the right to celebrate. So that Texas attitude goes into town, and the law enforcement is there in town. Very tricky balance, because the law enforcement was instructed to be somewhat tolerant because these towns needed those steers. So they had to be somewhat friendly toward the cattle drivers. The cowboy's skills come from the Spanish vaquero. The cattle drive is born now, all because of this business enterprise. That's the only reason that people had a need to push cattle from one area to another, outside, of course, of rotating pastures back home. The skills and the vocabulary were borrowed by the Texas cowboys and the Arizona cowboys and the New Mexico cowboys. But the Texans especially always had to put a little different twang on the words that they borrowed. You know, that word vaquero, which means herdsman, that was twisted to be buckaroo. The vaquero's rope was called la riata, and that's, of course, our lariat today. Another one is hakima. It's a makeshift halter that's made called the hackamore. Hackamore. I think America is one of the things that it excels in is taking other people's words and just completely fitting them to fit our own tongue. I come from Georgia, and do I see a lot of that? Here's an example for you. I live near a river called the Etowah, and it was called by the native people Itawa. Doesn't that sound perfectly Southern to change Itawa to Etowah? Well, the cattle drive created its own kind of image to America. I mean, people living in the towns saw these herds coming in and these flashy cowboys. They love to wear flashy colors. And the first thing they do when they came into town would be to buy a new wardrobe. You know, they got $90 in their pocket, cash, and they're going to visit a clothing store, a barbershop, they're going to get a bath somewhere, and then they're going to go to the gambling places, and then the houses of prostitution. Those were their 5 priorities. These people were exotic to the citizens who lived in the town. They were something really to gawk at. So there was a mystique about the cowboy already, and they saw him basically as being a troublemaker in the towns. Even though you might have a man in this group who was as straight as an arrow, you know, because of some of the others who were rowdy, this was the reputation that they grew. You know, in Arizona in the 1880s, if you were called a cowboy, you know what that meant? It meant you were a criminal. That was the literal name of the band of men in southeastern Arizona who did so much rustling and took American cattle to Mexico and then stole Mexican cattle and sold it to the butchers in America. They were called the Cowboys. I'm betting you a lot of people in here have seen Tombstone, the story, the movie, right? Kurt Russell, Val Kilmer. Val Kilmer stole that movie, didn't he? Remember how the faction that was always the antagonists they were called the Cowboys. Because of the adventurous life that was imagined for these men, publications began to crop up. This is the precursor of our tabloid of today. That magazine that you see at the checkout of a grocery store that's usually got a front page something like, I don't know, Val Kilmer meets alien behind his house one night. And that's pretty much on the order of the way these books were written. These were called penny dreadfuls or dime novels, and they were very, very popular. Not only in America, in the East, but also in Europe. And these promoted the cowboy. Sometimes the books were written about actual living people. Here are a few of them who were written about in the Penny Dreadfuls, and the stories were completely fictional. But because they were about people who were known, you've got Wild Bill Hickok, Sitting Bull, Jesse James, Kit Carson, Calamity Jane, William F. Cody, Buffalo Bill, and William Henry McCarty, alias William Antrim, alias Billy Bonnie, alias Billy the Kid. One of my favorite people in history. This lent some authenticity to the stories simply because they're real people. But the editors of all these magazines pushed their writers to exaggerate and to glamorize everything about the West. They glamorized outlawry, glamorized law enforcement, the scout, the bull whackers, the freight men, freight wagon drivers. Everything was exaggerated. And in these stories, whenever you had a love affair, it had to be platonic. That was just part of the times, Victorian times, you know. These magazines stirred the imagination of many, many people who decided to go west and become cowboys. I was recently in Wyoming where I was doing programs on a young man about whom I wrote a duology, 2 books, named Nate Champion. I think he's one of America's most impressive heroes, and I found that not many people know him. But in reading this about his friends especially, and people that were part of his story, so many of them got hooked into their cowboy role by reading these dime novels. It was their beginning. And I know of another situation where when Wyatt Earp was on the trail of outlaws and he found their camp, he found half-burned pages of a dime novel that was about outlaws. So these books, these little booklets were very widespread and had a tremendous influence. Here are some of the real life characters who were subject of great hyperbole. But no one promoted the Western mythology more than the person who used that story as a reputation. Hickok, Wild Bill Hickok, James Butler Hickok, is one of those bigger than life people who allowed the fictional stories about him to stay afloat. And I can almost guarantee you that inside Hickok's head, he's thinking, let them believe what they want out of those books about me, because it's intimidating. And if an adversary goes up against him, Hickok has got that working for him. So he became very famous in his own time. And he actually did some work for Buffalo Bill in his Wild West show. These are some of the writers that you'll probably never read about who wrote dime novels, because they wrote under different names to protect their literary reputation. Surprising, isn't it? All right, here's your master publicizer, Bill Cody. He was so famous in his own time that he put up this poster in the town before he would arrive there. That's all he needed. His name is there. It's kind of small, but think about that. That's pretty well known. What if you put your picture on a poster in Scottsdale and said, "I am coming"? Buffalo Bill's shows really sanitized and just cleaned up the whole image of the cowboy and the Indian fighter and the stagecoach driver. All of it was made to be consumed by the public and to inspire, to make young boys and young girls want to be like these people. You know, it was a big deal that Annie Oakley was part of that show, you know, because there weren't that many visible female role models that we had to work from. Calamity Jane can't probably go in that category, the more you know about her. But boy, Annie Oakley does. She's quite a lady. Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows could convince you, if you were a citizen at that time and you attended that, because look who some of his actors were. These are the real people. Some of these people fought at Little Bighorn. So if you saw this in an arena, you saw these men on horseback and the way they interacted with Cody's scripts, it would be very easy for you to believe that you were seeing the real thing. It was exciting. Buffalo Bill took his show all over America, into Canada, to Great Britain, performed before the Queen, and to the continental Europe. He was well known worldwide. In the early 20th century, one of the industries that began to boom here, which started in California, was the film industry. And in 1903, this movie came out, The Great Train Robbery, a huge success, and it was the beginning of the next 6 decades of Westerns, the Western being the main genre of movies. This was a silent movie. And many of the people in this movie were not necessarily actors. When this industry saw that the Western was going to be very important in cinematic history, then the producers and directors began to hire people who knew how to do things that belonged in a Western. So they were hiring wranglers, they were hiring men who had once been outlaws, but knew about how to reference the ways crimes went about. They had to hire people who knew how to handle a stagecoach. They had to hire people who were expert riders. Think about how just about every Western during the B-Western era ended, where the good guy had to leap off his horse and take off the bad guy off of his horse, right? And you had to have men who were able to do that. That's not just your average stuntman doing that. You've got to be able to ride a horse. So this industry drew a lot of authentic people into its fictional realm. But the momentum of the Western picked up in a huge way. This was America's first Western star. And he actually had a part in the Great Train Robbery. So he was just a bit part. Then he became the most famous Western star in America. He may be before a lot of your time, but he was an actor. He didn't have experience with horses. William S. Hart was a Shakespearean actor, but he worshipped the old American frontier lawman. That's who he played almost in every film. And he just wanted to befriend them. He befriended Bat Masterson, Seth Bullock from Deadwood, Wyatt Earp. He was a close friend of Wyatt Earp's and tried to help Wyatt get his story sold as a book. Tom Mix, I just ran into a great photograph of Tom Mix in that hallway right out there, just behind that wall. He grew up learning about horses in Pennsylvania, but he joined a Wild West show, so he was a very skilled person with horses. So these were your big megastars in their own time. You know, when you think about this man as a worker and compare this man as, our typical TV cowboy, and notice the word cowboy. Everyone's going to call this person a cowboy. All it takes, if you have a movie and everybody's wearing wide brim hats and high heel boots and carrying a pistol on the hip, it's a cowboy movie. It doesn't matter what occupations were. The word cowboy has now changed. It's become something else. I remember once in a town in New Mexico, I was standing on a sidewalk and I watched a woman walk by wearing boots, and another woman that she obviously knew said, "Oh, where did you get those cowboy boots?" Well, she got the gender wrong even. How could there be cowboy boots if a woman's wearing them, right? And it doesn't matter what your occupation is. Dress up the right way, you're going to be referred to as a cowboy. Then came the flood. These are the B-Westerns. You could take a look at this for a long time and get a lot of nostalgic feelings. Let me read off to you some of the old names and see if something comes back to you in your memories. Buck Jones, Tim Holt, Charles Sterrett, Johnny Mac Brown. He was an ex-football player for Alabama. Became a cowboy. Hoot Gibson, Ken Maynard, Sunset Carson, Rex Allen, Tex Ritter, Tim McCoy, Jimmy Stewart, Randolph Scott, Joel McRae, Roy Rogers, Dale Evans, Gene Autry. The Hollywood cowboy perpetrated a lot of the myths of the cowboy. Two in particular. This hardly ever happened in real life, where two men faced each other on a street, and yet it became the typical denouement for any Western, didn't it? It was what everything was headed toward, where the number one bad guy and the number one good guy were going to face each other. I can only think of 2 or 3 instances in history where that actually happened. Usually fights broke out like a flashpoint of violence where might be men sitting around a poker table and somebody jumps up and starts shooting at the man across the table and misses him. There's a story of 2 men shooting at each other across the table and no one was ever hit. They emptied their guns. One of these times was Wild Bill Hickok. It was a very rare instance of 2 men walking toward each other on a square in Missouri, and they stop, and then they draw their weapons and shoot 70 yards apart. And this will tell you why Wild Bill Hickok had a reputation. At 70 yards, with a Navy Colt, 38 caliber pistol, he hit that man in the heart from 70 yards. So that was a boost for his reputation. Another face-to-face like this was the so-called OK Corral, where you had 2 factions face each other, and guns were holstered, words were spoken, and then it exploded. That's very rare. All right, so that's one myth. Here's another. The so-called Code of the West. You could probably ask 10 different historians, what does that mean? And you'll get 10 different answers. But here's one of them. It's the good guy and the bad guy facing each other. And basically the good guy is saying, please, after you. The bad guy must draw first, right? Otherwise the story does not balance out right. That just didn't happen. There were probably more men shot in the back than in the front in the history of the West. One of the most addictive fabrications of Hollywood was this holster. A true cowboy would look at this holster and chuckle. You're going to lose your gun pretty fast out of this one. And look at here. If you tie it down, so what happens when you're in the sitting position on a horse before your gun's going to go? And of course, Hollywood then invented the leather thong that goes around the handle. This is called the Buscadero holster, and it became the standard holster for all Westerns because it was so amenable to the fast draw. You know, an old-time holster would have been, this portion here would have been looped over the entire belt so that it rode a lot higher. And in the true using of guns and violence in the West, it was really not about quickness. There was something else that was more important. And the best way to say it, I guess, is deliberation. If you were a person who was willing to kill, and anybody else knew that about you, in other words, there would be no hesitation. So it's not about a quick draw, but it's not about there is no hesitation. I'm going to take my weapon out and kill you. That's what speed in a gunfight truly means. But this became a sport, literally. You had many of the famous Western movie stars like to tell the public how fast they were. So there was a way to do that. I'll never forget when that came out in the Life magazine when I was a little boy. And it had Hugh O'Brien standing with his fingers on a timer. And as soon as he left that timer, the time started. And so he went for his gun and shot. And when he shot, the timer stops. And so he was at 0.2 of a second for that. So this became a very addictive sport. When this came on TV, by the way, the same week, this one came on. And this was one of the longest running series in the history of television. It's been outdone now, but in its time, it was the leader. These were the first so-called adult Westerns. Wyatt Earp never had anything to do with a steer, a cow, a calf. And yet, this was a cowboy show, just as Gunsmoke was. But it was an adult Western. And this is the way it was labeled by the producers of this. And here's what that meant. Now we're going to have a sophisticated story for adults to follow. So basically it gave adults a rationale for being able to watch Westerns and not feel like they were little kids anymore. This one was so interesting to me because I didn't realize this at the time when I was a little boy, because as new Westerns came on, you just accepted them for what they were. But, you know, the Life and Legend of Wyatt Earp presented for the first time a gimmick weapon. I shouldn't say the first time, because the first time that I really know of would be from the Arthurian legend, Excalibur. That's a unique weapon, and the way that he got it. Well, Wyatt Earp was supposed to have had this 16-inch or 18-inch, depending on who you listen to, long Colt pistol called the Buntline Special. It was fictional. That truly was not a weapon that Earp owned. But that gimmick started a fad. And Gunsmoke had no gimmicks because it came out at the same time. But the Westerns that followed the Earp series, almost everyone had a gimmick. Think about it. Remember Steve McQueen and Wanted Dead or Alive? Remember his weapon? A sawed-off rifle that he carried in a holster. You know, that's a gimmick. Paladin of Have Gun Will Travel. His gimmick was that card. There was another Western called The Restless Gun that copied this one, where the actor John Payne had a barrel that he could screw onto his other barrel and make it a long rifle, which is absurd when you think about where the threads would go inside that barrel. A bullet could never get out of there. If Wyatt Earp could hear from his grave that he was the most famous, his TV show was the most famous cowboy movie, we would hear some grumbling under there. Because Wyatt never had anything to do with the cowboy. And remember, he went to Arizona and Tombstone where the word cowboy meant outlaw. Those were his nemesis. Warner Brothers jumped into this game and changed it in a big way. These are all the Warner Brothers stars from their separate series. Lawman, Colt 45, Maverick, Bronco, Lawman again, and Sugarfoot. In 1958, when I was 11 years old, 8 of the top 10 TV shows were Westerns. It's hard to make a teenager today believe that. In the next year, when I was 12, there were 48 Westerns. 48 Western series on. Throughout the 1950s and 60s, guess how many Western series debuted? 130. So this dominated the airways, didn't it? And all of us who grew up with this were greatly influenced by it. It's probably why most of you here are around my age, probably. These were our heroes. And the TV world delivered them to us in that way. They wanted us to have these heroes. They influenced us. I'll tell you a real personal one for myself. Remember the rifleman? He's not on. Yeah, Chuck Connors over there. Remember his son? Remember what his name was? Mark, which was my name. Well, I had an awful relationship with my father. I mean, it was where I learned fear. And when this came on, it basically saved me. And the fact that the son's name was Mark, somebody up there was looking after me on that. But the way that Lucas McCain treated his son taught me so much. I never experienced that myself, so I got to see it. So I'm grateful for that. All fiction, and yet it's very, very instructive. I was having a discussion before the program outside about fiction versus nonfiction, and the lady that I was talking to didn't want to hear anything I had to say about the fiction. Really, she was more interested in the history. But what I'm all about with my books is I love history, and I am not going to feed the reader incorrect history, but I'm going to try to put it all so that you learn the history completely. But I'm putting it in a story that wants to keep you going, turning that page. I think makes the story more readable. So don't think of historical novelists as people who are pulling your leg and just using a famous name. Most people who do this genre really know their subject. Remember I told you this was a sport? And literally it is. There's a World Championship fast draw contest. There are clubs in Europe. Fast draw contest. And look at his time there. He didn't quite beat Hugh O'Brien, but that's an impressive time. And look, completely unlike anything that would be realistic. Again, if Wyatt could come up out of his grave and see this, he'd just shake his head. This man has no sight of his pistol. He's learned a technique where he gets his body in a certain stance, and by the angle of his leg, he knows exactly how his hand is going to come out of the holster and where it should be pointed. So that means if he was in a gunfight with several different people, he'd have to be moving around like that, because that's the only way he knows his accuracy. One day I'll be doing this program and this guy will be seated in the program. Then I'll hear a gunshot go off and that's it. Okay. I want to read you two excerpts from diaries from cowboys. Gloomy times ever I saw. This day has been spent in crossing the West Trinity River. I swam it 5 times. Upset our wagon in the river and lost many of our cooking utensils. Lost my knife today. Then there's time goes by. Cold morning, wind blowing and hands all shivering. It was one of our party drowned today, Mr. Carr, and several others, narrow escapes and I among the number. Men are all tired and want to leave. I am in Indian country and I am annoyed by them. Many men in trouble. Horses gave out and the men refused to do anything. Time passes. Hard rain and a windstorm. Beeves ran and I had to be on my horseback all night. Awful night. Wet all night. Almost starved, not having a bite to eat for 60 hours. Oh, what a night. Thunder, lightning, and rain. Am almost dead from lack of sleep. I am not homesick, but heartsick. Beautiful, clear night. And this morning I went on guard so cold my teeth chattered. And here's the next excerpt from a different man. My back is blistered badly from exposure while in the river, and I and 2 others are suffering very much. I was attacked by a beef in the river and had a very narrow escape from being hurt by diving. I have a sick headache bad. Had a great time gathering blackberries. Last night was another of those that try a man. It thundered and lightened all night and rained one hard rain. Beeves ran. Wind blew. Was on my horse the whole night. We turned south and west. The day was warm and the flies were worse than I ever saw them. Our animals were almost ungovernable. Lost my coat and went back for it. The Osages visit our camp. They are great beggars. We are all right, but 2 men down with boils and ague. Could not reach wood or water and had to stay on the prairie without fire or water. The country continues rough and rocky, almost impassable in places. Found a human skeleton on the prairie today. Cattle stampeded and ran past 2 farms, and the people there were very angry. I was sick last night and had a chill and colic this morning. Feel very badly yet. Everything parching under the summer sun. A very sick man in camp has had 2 severe fits. I got struck by a horse in the face and have a very sore eye, and I'm still troubled with colic. I was very sick and slept none. I had severe shakes. You know, you think about a man going through this and then taking the time to sit down and write it. That makes it a lot more personal to me. I'm going to sing a song for you. This is a song that I wrote, and it's about a cowboy. So I find it to be very appropriate. I got to tell you about the beginnings of this song. There was one winter when I was working for a summer camp off season, and I was doing a lot of fence work, which I really liked. You know, it made me feel like I was out west. And I had this one tool that I used. It was, it looked kind of like pliers, but it had also wire cutters. It had a little pry bar on it. Gosh, what else? Probably AM, FM radio. I don't remember what I was on, but it was. I named my tool. I named it Bob Wire. In the South, no one says barbed wire. It's Bob Wire. So I thought I would write a funny song about a guy named Bob Wire. And you're about to hear it, and it's anything but funny. It's more like a mini-series, really. Old Bob stepped off the evening train, gone as far as he had legal tender. He looked out upon the lonely plain, but all he saw there was his own surrender. While the stars spelled out his destiny, he closed his eyes to the pain. The brightest star burned out and fell from the sky. He never saw it, but he knew just the same. He joined the circuit down at Abilene, broke his shoulder on a wrong named treason. In Albuquerque he snapped it clean again, hit the wall and put him out for the season. He takes some time up in Wyoming, some honest work, just pushing cattle. And he'd be back to ride the rodeo again and get that star to shine again somehow. He met some boys out on the Circle J. Hired him on to ride the miles of fences, though they poke some fun sometimes about his name. They never knew him, never broke through his defenses, 'cause he's just waiting on his bones to mend. That's when Susanna stepped off of a morning train. He didn't know it, but the star began to shine again. She'd been to Georgia just to visit her relations. She took them turquoise and the smile that won the West, 'cause she's as much Wyoming as the prairie and the mountains. She was the thing most of the boys liked about it best. But there's a thorn beneath the desert rose, and there's a ring on her finger. But all the boys fall in love with her anyway, for a beauty such as hers is seldom rendered. I guess that everyone could see the thing coming. Each time their eyes met, it would last a little longer. And though they never let a word of love be spoken, deep down inside them, the feelings just grew stronger. And in the garden when she sang to the soil, she'd find a new braid of leather. Sometimes when he saddled up before the dawn, there'd be a piece of pie and rose wrapped up together. Now Bob, he never made it back to the arena, though I never heard him blame it on his shoulder. Wandered up to Canada upon a Palomino, drove a string of horses that he purchased down in Boulder, and all the boys back in Wyoming still stand in line for some coffee. That's how they get to pass a moment with Susanna, as she smiles and thinks about the way things must be. Barbed wire. I'd like to just mention to you a little bit about my books to give you an idea of what they are about. Just last week, I'm so proud to say this, my book on Billy Bonnie, Billy the Kid, won the Arizona, New Mexico Book Award for Best Historical Fiction. Hear that, Billy? And I have a trilogy on Wyatt Earp. That's my main study, as I told you earlier. And it's based on all the research of the best researchers in the world, who I'm fortunate to say are friends of mine now. And we go out to the places where things happen and see. It's such a thrill to go to a piece of land, to know what happened there, and to see how the layout of the land maybe shaped that incident. And I just finished a duology, as I mentioned also, on Nate Champion. For those of you who've never heard of Nate, let me just say this. He never knew that he would be anything close to a hero. In fact, he died not knowing that. But his heroism in what he did over an 8-hour period alone against 50 men saved the lives of 70 people who were on a hit list by a mafia-like group of very wealthy Wyoming cattle owners. It's an incredible story about insurrection by the wealthy, the Johnson County Wars. So that's my latest book, 2 books. In 2022, I was voted to be a Georgia Author of the Year with my book, Song of the Horseman, which is about a Cherokee horse trainer in North Carolina. Do we have any Longmire fans in here? Okay. What I'm about to tell you, Longmire is I guess it was a cable series, is that right? About a modern day Wyoming sheriff. His name was Walt Longmire. It was filmed in New Mexico. But Longmire really caught on. A lot of people loved it. It lasted for, I think, about 5 or 6 years. You just have to take my word for this. I'm not going to tell you a lie. I wrote a Longmire book myself before that happened. And it's an Eastern story, though. It's an Eastern sheriff. It's very much Longmire. So I mention that just because if you like Longmire, that would be a good book I would suggest for you. It's called Last of the Pistoliers. So it's a person in the East who's in love with the Old West, and he's a history teacher who becomes sheriff. I've got one book that has a guarantee on it. Have you ever had a warranty on a book? Money back? I'm serious. It's called The Western Trail Travesties. It's 5 stories. Here's the subtitle, and maybe give you an idea of what it's about. The Western Trail Travesties, 5 little-known tales of the Old West that probably ought to have stayed that way. It's 5 different comedy westerns. If I needed to compare it to something, I would think that the Coen brothers would need to do these as a film. And also I did a book called Moon of the White Tears, which flips the Trail of Tears. I've always wanted to write some kind of story where the white man was victimized, and this is that story. And again, it's a Coen brothers story. So it's a comedy. And it takes place in my hometown, where I come from, Dahlonega, Georgia. Cherokee word for yellow rock. It's where gold was first discovered. First biggest gold rush in America. Did you know that? A little old Dahlonega, Georgia. Oh, let's see what I'm leaving out here. My very first book is called 2 Winters in a Teepee. It's a memoir of the 2 years that I lived in a teepee in the forest. And I've been trying to get published a long time. I'd written the Earp stories, and the Earp story, the trilogy, was in one book, about that thick. And it had one title. And the publishers said, nope, too big, we're going to make it a trilogy. So I had that book I was trying to get published, and I was getting just so many rejection letters. Any writer will tell you the same sob story. It is a long haul to get published. But that was my first effort. And finally, a friend of mine who lives in New York and was actually David Letterman's assistant. And guess what her goal in life was before she went to New York?
Get your book published.
She said, no, I wish it was. But she said her goal in life, I want to be David Letterman's assistant. And she did it. I'm very impressed with that young lady. Anyway, we had a conversation on the phone one time. She was a camper of mine when I was a counselor at a summer camp. So we got to be very good friends. And she said, write a memoir. And I said, that's ridiculous. Who would read a memoir about somebody they'd never heard of? Write a memoir. She said, that's what's selling right now. So I said, well, I'll try. She said, write about those 2 years you lived in a teepee. So I did, and it became a pretty good seller, and it's now enjoying a big second wind. A lot of people are getting it now. It's the beauty of the book to me is that, Annie Dillard once said, if you really want to know nature, you've got to get in its way. You've got to be right there at the main intersection all the time. And when you live in the forest in a teepee, that's exactly what happens. Plus your teepee adds something to the place. It becomes part of the story. You can't believe how many animal stories are in that book. They're true stories about my confrontation with animals, some of whom came into the teepee. All on friendly terms. There are no tragedies in this book. I'm sure I'm leaving something out, but... Oh yeah, my very first novel, Indigo Heaven, is a cowboy story. So, and it won what? Will Rogers Award, yeah. I always have to mention those little awards because it kind of authenticates these things. I'm so proud when they get voted for something like that. You know, I'm proud for the book. The book becomes an entity in itself. You know, I feel like, way to go, book. The book says, you wrote me. And I say, oh yeah. But I'll be out there with my wife Susan and help you know about those books if you're interested. So thank you for coming this afternoon.